So now we will move on to Carla Morgan, the collections manager at Bishop Museum Library and Archives. Carla?
Hi, thanks, Shannon. Aloha kako, I'm Carla Morgan. I am the collections manager at Bishop Museum Library and Archives. Bishop Museum is the state's largest museum. We are dedicated to the natural and cultural history of Hawaii and the Pacific. The Library and Archives is just one department in the larger museum. Our responsibility is to care for primary source materials on paper and also published works. And I am also going to share my screen. Okay, so just a quick note before I begin. Our Library and Archives has suspended our normal public reference hours during the pandemic, but the museum itself is currently open to visitors 7 days a week, and our staff are continuing to work across all of the museum departments and the collection. So my final slide is going to list URLs for all of the web resources that I mentioned in this presentation. And then on the Bishop Museum website, I would especially encourage everyone to visit the various departmental web pages. Each of these is going to have their own resource links and their own databases. For now, I'll just focus on the Library and Archives. Like I mentioned, we're responsible for published works and primary source materials related to Hawaii and the Pacific. So this year's History Day theme, communication in history, gave me the opportunity to think about and to appreciate the role of communication in shaping the records that we care for in the Library and Archives. What survives today as a piece of art or a manuscript or a photograph, an audio recording or a map existed in the first place because of the constant human motivation to communicate what we see, hear, think, and feel. For example, to communicate what their eyes saw and perhaps to say what words couldn't adequately describe, early Western explorers brought visual artists on board their expeditions throughout the Pacific. And many of these illustrations were later engraved, and they were widely distributed in publications. And this fueled a worldwide fascination with Hawaii and the Pacific. But some, like the sketch of the canoe that you see on the bottom right of your screen, were never finished. This was a sketch by John Weber, who was the artist on board Captain Cook's third voyage. And this is an example of one of the works that we hold in our collection. And then when the written alphabet and paper and printing technology were adopted in Hawaii, the debates, the poetry and the genealogies and the storytelling that was previously held in oral communication found profuse expression in the newspapers and the diaries and the correspondence. The records that this leaves us with offer a rich history to explore, but it also came at a cost, as the living narrative contained an oral tradition passed away with Hawaiian elders. And as early as the 1920s, efforts were made to record the ancestral knowledge of Hawaiian people in voice. And I'll point you toward online resources for the Helen Roberts Mele collection in the Library and Archives in a later slide that addresses that. A lot of these efforts centered at Bishop Museum. They continued throughout the 20th century in the work of fine scholars like Mary Kawena Pukui, who is pictured in my opening slide. And this gentleman you see in the center of your screen is Kuluwai Maka. The time that this photo was taken, it was in 1933. Kuluwai Maka was 87 years old. He was a court chanter for Kalakaua, and that's Kenneth Emery recording his mele on the campus of Bishop Museum. So before I jump into some of our digital resources, I just want to acknowledge that there is so much work to be done to bring Bishop Museum's Library and Archives collections into a digital space. Even though we're vast and we're an important collection, we're far from being at the forefront of having our collections accessible online. Many of the collections that you'll hear from in this series are actually better adapted and have adapted to the changing needs of researchers, both before the COVID pandemic and as a result of it. So this time next year, I plan to have many more resources to share with the group. And so I will move on. Okay, so the starting point for exploring Bishop Museum Library and Archives online is through the Bishop Museum website, bishopmuseum.org. Like I mentioned, we're just one department in the museum, and each department has its own resources and its own databases. I made a little live link here so we can travel to our webpage together. So I'm going to take you to the Library and Archives main department page. It's important to keep in mind that the databases on the Library and Archives webpage, they offer records only. And that means that it'll offer a catalog description and a call number. But in most cases, you'll need to contact our department to get reference resources and PDFs. So I'll show you. We have two catalogs here. First off, Library and Archives. So Library is for published material, and then the archives are for unpublished primary source material that includes the maps, manuscripts, photographs, audio collection, and all of that. So once you go in here, you have the opportunity to search the collection by keyword, which is what I would recommend. And you have the opportunity to combine keywords in a Boolean search. So you can search for something like, I'm going to search for Kaiwi Ula, which is the place name for the land that our museum stands on. And I'm going to do a keyword search. And I'm going to allow it to search across our whole archives collection. And so these records will pop up. You'll see all kinds of formats for different call numbers, and that just tells us the type of material it is. The first one's a microfilm, second one is a manuscript, and the third is an audio recording. And for any more information, you can click on that blue link and it will give you a longer description. Call numbers are usually at the bottom. So if you find something that's of interest to your research, I encourage you to email us and I'll share that email address with you to find out more. Let's see, I'm gonna go back. So that's our Library and Archives main database. We also have blogs that provide primary source material. One recent project, like I mentioned, the collection of mele was a concerted effort starting in the 1920s, because mele is poetry, but it encompassed genealogy, place names, just so many aspects of Hawaiian thought. And in the 1920s, a woman named Helen Roberts came over. She was an ethnomusicologist, and she was tasked with recording mele across the Hawaiian Islands. And with support from the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we were able to conduct a project over the past 2 years to provide digital transcripts and their translations of the mele online here on our Veloho blog. So this is a project that is aiming to just increase accessibility to mele, to make them more searchable. One quirk of our cataloging of mele up until now is that it's only searchable by the first 2 lines. So if the search term you wanted was down in the 6th line, you wouldn't necessarily find it that way. So Puale, our staff member who has been running this project and blogging about it, has paired photographs from the collection with the mele and with some historical background as well. So it's been a really great place for a community to come together to talk about mele that they know, and history and genealogy. A lot of people have made some awesome connections there. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, let's see. Oh, I should probably. So Hawaii Live is actually, it's going to come up on screen. So this is a resource especially dedicated to DOE teachers. So this is based on DOE curriculum. I will acknowledge that this site was put together back in 2011. So standards might have changed, and actually the museum and our education staff are working to update this site. So you'll see different curriculum material, including primary resources. There's some photographs in there, there's some audio recordings, to explore based on the standards that you are in, the grade standards. And then last, Online Learning Center. So this is a resource that has recently emerged from the museum to address the fact that a lot of people cannot come to the museum right now in the pandemic. So this is an online resource that is continually being updated. So there are resources in the history section. Library and Archives has been contributing photographs based on various themes that are explored in here. So you can keep looking out for new content. Okay, and then I also want to mention Papakilo database. In the past, a lot of our digitized collections have been put online at Papakilo, which is an OHA database as a central resource. So our Hawaiian ethnological notes, which were compiled by Mrs. Pukui, oftentimes Hawaiian language newspapers that she translated and arranged by theme and described, or various knowledge that she has gleaned from oral tradition. Those are on there. They're searchable by a keyword. So if you were looking for material on Kalo, you could search for Kalo, and there's some translated Hawaiian language newspaper material on there currently. We have the Kekuhuna collection on Papakilo. So Kekuhuna was an associate of a Bishop Museum archaeologist, and he lived in the 1800s to 1950s, I believe. And he was very focused on gathering knowledge from traditional sources. And he drew wonderful maps of heiau, mostly on Hawaii Island, I believe, with descriptions of some of the functions of the heiau. So that's a really awesome map collection that we have on Papakilo database. The John Stokes collection. Stokes was also an anthropologist, and he mapped heiau, and he also took photographs of people around the islands. And then the last one, and I just need to go back, I'm sorry. The last one I mentioned here is the Sullivan collection. Lewis Sullivan was also an anthropologist, and he photographed Hawaiian people across the Hawaiian Islands in 1920. He was of that generation of anthropologists who was also very interested in race. And so as a part of his research, he actually recorded the races that people said they were, and he wrote those down. And then years later, in the 1980s, the museum brought a team of staff over to actually follow up with the family whose family were photographed and actually get more information about their genealogical connections. So that has actually turned out to be a wonderful genealogical resource for a lot of people. Okay, and finally, Ulu Ulu Archive, in partnership with Ulu Ulu and with support from HCH, we now have 110 film clips from the Bishop Museum Moving Image Collections up on their website, and they will be presenting on October 23rd. So if you would like to learn more about that, they will be here in this space. And here is the slide with some of those URLs that I mentioned to you. Okay, sorry, I think that was a whirlwind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carla. That was amazing. Wow, that's a lot of content for our students and our teachers. Hopefully they get to check it out. Thank you so much.